All right, good evening everyone. My name is Simon Göke and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Munich Stadtmuseum, Münchner Stadtmuseum. I'm very, very pleased that you have found your way to us, although we have the maybe warmest day this year until now. And also the FC Bayern, as I just read, won the championship. You will see, I can tell you right away, you made the right decision to come here because we will certainly have many more warm days this year, perhaps soon more warm days than we would like to. But what we get tonight is really special. Tonight's event is dedicated to a topic that is far underrepresented in the culture of remembrance, and it features outstanding scientists and artists. I'm very, very pleased that Rika Benvenistes has come all the way from Athens, from Thessaloniki, and I would like to thank her very much to come here to Germany, to Munich. I would also like to thank Yara Haskiel, who gave us a really great gift by bringing her exhibition, We Can Never Fly First Class, here to the Munich Stadtmuseum, to the Galerie Einwand. If you haven't seen it, it's just displayed for one more week. So please visit the Galerie Einwand, see the exhibition, tell your friends. It's only 1 week. We have it here. But now I will hand over to the moderator, Maria Alexopoulou. I would also like to thank her very much to coming from Mannheim to here, to Munich, and preparing this evening. Maria Alexopoulou is a substitute professor of contemporary history in Mannheim, and since 2020 she's also project manager at the Center of Research on Antisemitism at the TU Berlin. Maria Alexopoulou habilitated in December 2002 at the University of Mannheim with the habilitation thesis Racist Knowledge in the Transformation of the Federal Republic of Germany into an Immigration Society. I can only recommend you all to read her publications. We two meet first time in Bochum in 2020 when we both presented at the Commission of Memory Cultures of Social Democracy on the topic of migration. However, she has also done research on the topic of homeless foreigners and is very currently also dealing with the history of Thessaloniki. So it was a perfect fit, and we are all very happy that you are able to take the time and come here to Munich. Please take over.
So I want to thank you, Simon, Simon, for inviting me and giving me the honor and the pleasure to firstly present you our two speakers for the evening, and then after they have their talks, we will discuss about their talks, about their work. So I start with presenting to you Henriette Rika Benveniste. She was born in Thessaloniki. She studied history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and completed her doctoral studies in medieval history at the Universität der Sorbonne in Paris. She is now professor of European medieval history at the Department of History, Archaeology and Social Anthropology of the University of Thessaly in Volos. Her research in medieval history includes issues of law and society, religiosity and conversion, Jewish history, and historiography. She has also researched and written on the Holocaust, and her current research is on the history of Jews in the post-war years and the immigration of Greek Jews, and her work on post-war history of Jews is what she will talk about this evening. One very or a recent monograph and a very or I say the title, Those Who Survive, Deportation, Resistance, Return, It was published 2014 in Greek, and it was translated 2 years afterwards in German, and is already translated in English too last year. And it was, as I can tell, it was one of the first monographs dealing with the history of the survivors of the Shoa in Thessaloniki. And another publication of hers, it is recent, from 2017, Luna, an essay in historiographical biography in Greek, and is now translated in French. And both of these books received state awards, and also deal, I think the first one too, with historiographical issues and change of view on how we look at history. But we will talk about this later on. So I will also present you Yara Haskiel. She will present her talk after Rika. She began her politicization, as she told me, began when she joined the anti-racist group Kanakatak. And after that, she studied experimental film and media art at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste Hamburg and in Berlin with Hito Steierl and Heinz Emigoli and Gerd Roscher. She holds a master in museology and critical theory from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. In 2040-50, she took part in the Independent Studies program at the Museum for Contemporary Art, also in Barcelona. Central themes of her work are the connections between memory and displacement of minor and forgotten narratives and their transgenerational affective constellations. Further, she focuses on micropolitics and its precarities. She has made many video essays and multi-screen installations, and she's been experimenting with a video diary and new media and found footage, what she found about various topics. She was a PhD scholar of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and currently conducts her practice-based dissertation with a focus of transnational memory studies at the Visual Culture Department at Goldsmiths, London. Her collaborative exhibition project, Personal Geographies, was realized in Berlin and Belgrade from 2016 to 2018. In 2019, her research project, Assembly of Sleepless Matter, I have to ask you about this, what this was about, was granted with the Artist Research Fellowship by the Senate Department for Culture and Europe from Berlin. In 2021, Yara Haskiel has been a fellow at Künstlerhaus Büchsenhausen. Her new video, Precarious Twilight Zones, was exhibited at Kunstpavillon Innsbruck and at Transition Festival of Contemporary Jewish Arts in Berlin in 2021. As I already told you, we will now hear Rika Benvenistes' talk, Life in Spite of All, Greek Jews as heimatlose Ausländer, followed by Yara Haskiel's presentation, We Can Never Fly First Class, and afterwards we have a discussion. So, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very honored to be here with you today, and I would like to thank the organizers. Thank you, Yara. Thank you, Simon. I'm really very happy to be with you today. When the war was over, liberated former camp inmates continued to die en masse. Thousands among them had to be hospitalized in order to recover. Hunger, cold, terror, and exhaustion had been pervasive. In the spring of 1945, millions of ex-prisoners were coming out of prisons, camps, factories, and hideouts, embarking on a return journey, but by whatever means were available. Transportation was slow, and they often wandered for months, delayed by unexpected meetings. Greek Jewish camp survivors had also to be hospitalized, travel, or wander before returning to Greece. Once they returned, many felt estranged from the homeland because others were unwilling to listen to their pain and to share their mourning. Jewish camp victims found that their experiences were trivialized. They were told that, after all, during the war, everybody had suffered. They felt alienated and alone, cut off from the certainties of the past, from their old beliefs. They had been exiled from their own lives. A sense that there was a scale of torment. The pain could be measured by degree, came to poison their desire for normal life. But what might normal life mean? Anger, pain, loneliness, undeserved guilt, joy, and hope succeeded one another endlessly. Some chose never to return, and others returned only to live again in search of a new homeland. Everyone faced the loss of family and loved ones. Neither their joy and hope of freedom nor their eventual economic recovery can obscure the utter misery and desolation of those years. Reconstruction was carried out in the midst of huge refugee crisis and in the context of Cold War and international geopolitics. Reconstruction also involved retribution and war crime trials, aiming to purge post-war European societies from Nazis and Nazism, depending on the will or the unwillingness to purge societies and from Nazis and their collaborators. Certainly, liberation put an end to Nazi rule, but its effects were to last for many years. In the ruined landscapes of the post-war years, for many Jewish camps victims, exile in Germany lasted for years. There were also those for whom exile in Germany, living among the Allies and the Germans, lasted many years in a rapidly changing world. Uprooted refugees, they were immigrants in waiting, displaced persons, who certainly did not know how long their state of limbo would last. In the meantime, their daily life and their fate was in the hands of the international political actors and humanitarian bureaucrats. The International Refugees Organization, the IRO, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, the American Joint Distribution Committee, JOINT, and when finally everything was over, when they arrived to a new homeland, the memory of that time between the horrors of the camp and the demands of the new life was erased. And while the records of the institutions and organizations that illuminate the circumstances of their existence treat displaced persons through statistics as passive subjects, recipients of charity, the fragments of their own written words and their testimonies many years later can restore them in the eyes of historians as active subjects who actively participated in shaping their own lives. The second part of my book on those who survived was devoted to the little-known story of a group of survivors from Salonika who, upon liberation, chose not to repatriate, but remained in Bavaria, staying in Feldafing, a camp for displaced persons, waiting for a visa for the United States or an opportunity to emigrate to Palestine. It was in the post-war Jewish press initially and later in Thessaloniki's Jewish community archives that I had discovered a list of these people's names and also the correspondence between their organization, Vertretungsprofessorin Juden, and the Jewish community of Salonika. And still later, in the audiovisual archives, I found the testimonies collected for the most part during the 80s and the 90s of about 40 of the 73 Salonikans who remained in Germany until the DP camp was dismantled. In my book, I adopted a micro-historical approach aiming to render the uncountable men and women who went through these events visible and thus provide a more profound and nuanced understanding of the Shoah and of the immediately post-war years. Deported to Auschwitz in 1943, like most Jews from Salonika, they represented the tiny minority of those not immediately gassed. In the autumn of 1943, they were transferred to Warsaw to work in the ruins of the ghetto after the revolt that had taken place there was crushed. Faced with the advance of the Soviets, they were evacuated and put on a death march to other camps, to Dachau, then to Mühldorf, and to Waldlager. They were liberated by the American army on April 30 in Tutzing, near Munich, and finally they were transferred to the Feldafing DP camp. Their history unfolded on the backstage of the grand political and military history. Archives and testimonies reveal the daily life of what they called the Jewish lager, their search for relatives, the black market, their sociability, the organization of their Sephardic association, their conflict with Ashkenazi Jews, their love and marriage stories, their Zionist commitment, and the experiences of those who emigrated illegally to Palestine, the departure of others for the United States or for Israel. I think that the microhistory of this group of Greek Jewish DPs allows us to deepen our reflection on the role that circumstance and chance play in shaping the unknown events that mark the lives of survivors during a period that, albeit sometimes suppressed from memory, was decisive for what turned out to be their future. In the years following the publication of my book, further research revealed that by time Feldafing closed down in 1949, not all refugees had realized their dream for emigration. Among them were a handful of Jews from Salonika. In 1953, there were still 18,000 Jewish DPs left in West Germany. Out of the 63 DP camps, only Föhrenwald, 25 kilometers southwest of Munich, continued to function. The last inhabitants of the other camps had been transferred there. Until 1948, relatively good conditions prevailed in the camp for the approximately 4,000 Jewish DPs who were separated from Germans by a 2-meter high fence. Residents dreaming of emigration named the street of the camp after the names of American cities, American states: New Jersey Strasse, Missouri Strasse, Florida. Until 1950, the community flourished. Largely self-governed, it had its own police, political parties, religious and educational institutions, and a vibrant cultural life. After 1946, there were also small shops and inmates engaged in all kinds of trades. Zionism offered a vision for many, while others waited for an increase in the immigration quota and for the official document whereby a relative residing in the US declared that the prospective emigrant would not constitute a burden for the state. The second period in the history of Föhrenwald, from 51 to 56, found a group of the weak or sick DPs deprived of the leadership of the intellectual elite whose members had departed for the newly established State of Israel with the mass emigration exodus of 48 and 49. Moreover, in December 51, the camp came under German administration and was named Government Transit Camp for Stateless Foreigners. This landmark change caused anxiety and psychological turmoil among the refugees. Their camp would no longer be run by allies in cooperation with the IRO and the Joint, but by the Germans, but the Germans would be in charge. The German police could now raid the camp, make arrests, and take someone to a German prison. The insecurity of the stateless foreigners was exacerbated by the fact that they were now faced with the rise of anti-Semitism, to which all the sources testify. Along the old stereotypes that were projected on them, all those who remained in Germany were stigmatized as lazy and criminally inclined. The report by the delegation of the Swiss Red Cross that visited the camp in May 53 was positive regarding the overall camp management, sanitation, and living conditions in the camp, and the medical care provided by the sanatorium. Although they did not refute the report completely, two Thessalonican Jews that had written to the community of Thessaloniki a year earlier in Judeo-Spanish pointed a worse picture. So the two guys, Albert Ayas and Perachi Aruch, lamented the fact that since the withdrawal of the IRO, the camp, now run by the German authorities, I cite, looks like a second concentration camp with only one difference. We are free and we are not mistreated. And they continued. 1,800 Jews live here, of which 600 suffer from tuberculosis. Ayas and Aruch speak in the name of the 12 Greek citizens from Thessaloniki, 5 of whom suffered from tuberculosis and 6 that were still healthy but risked contracting the disease. They said that they did not know when they would get out of the cursed camp of misery, Maldito Campo de Miseria in Judeo-Spanish, where joint assistance amounted to only one food package per month that only lasted 1 week. They live cut off from civilization, while the Polish Jews who help each other often despise them. It seems that a handful of Sephardim and the Polish Jews were in constant confrontation, as was also the case in Feldafing and elsewhere. In 1955, there were only 8 Jews from Thessaloniki left in Föhrenwald, among them 2 suffering from tuberculosis in the sanatorium, while 2 others, Maurice Baruch and Sam Haskiel, resided outside the camp in Munich. Scarcity of housing was cause of rivalries between DPs, Germans, and Allied soldiers. Most of the Greeks were married to a wife who was not Greek. Albert Ayas, born in Salonika in 1917, had been well educated in a commercial high school and spoke 4 languages. He writes to the president of the Jewish community of Salonika in Judeo-Spanish. He wants to thank him for the parcel he had received and recounts his story. Deported to Auschwitz, he was liberated in Theresienstadt. While being hospitalized in Prague, he met his future wife. They had planned they had planned to emigrate to the US. But meanwhile, the communist Czech government closed the American Visa Bureau. He and his pregnant wife managed to flee, however, Prague, thanks to help from the Greek ambassador. Another Greek, Moïse Alalouf, had repatriated to Greece in 1948, accompanied by the Romanian woman he had met in Germany. However, after having emigrated to Israel, from Greece to Israel, they returned to Germany with their newborn child. At that time, he was working at the Föhrenwald police, hoping to emigrate to Canada. Another Greek, Sinto Sevi, had met his Lithuanian wife in Feldafing, and they too were also hoping to emigrate to Canada. Exiles correspond with the community back in Salonika. It is worth noting that since the 1920s, the community represented the Jewish community in Salonika represented its members to the state and was committed to improving the living condition and the education prospects of the poorer among them. So the Greek Jews of Föhrenwald addressed the Salonika community leaders, often collectively or individually, and they identified as community members and as Greek citizens. What did these foreigners stateless write about? They requested various certificates, criminal records, papers from the conscription office, from the municipality or the police, as well as documents required by the immigration authorities. They exchanged wishes for the Jewish holidays. They asked for material assistance, and since sending money was forbidden, they asked for food parcels, making special mention of nutritious and tasty Greek olives. I had located the name of Sam Haskiel or Haskiel in Feldafing's list of Greeks. Subsequent research revealed part of his life story. In a letter dated November 29, in 1949, the Jewish community of Salonika responds to a letter addressed to them by Sam Haskiel requesting a birth certificate. At the time, this was a common request, and the community secretary duly replies that Haskiel should specify his date of birth, provide a certificate confirming that he is still alive, and finally obtain a birth certificate from the Greek consulate in Germany. Haskiel's letter, stapled to the copy of the reply, tells us that at the time he was living in Munich, in Pariser Strasse, and wanted to emigrate to the United States. His application for economic assistance also has the same date, and from it we learn that before the war, Haskiel was a fisherman and he was deported to Auschwitz. From there, he was transferred first to Warsaw and then to Dachau. From a subsequent letter to the community, we also learned that he was born in 1918. He had fought in the Albanian army in the mountain artillery, and that in Auschwitz he had lost his parents, one sister, and 3 brothers. He wanted to emigrate with his wife, born in Munich in 1925, and with their 2 children, Harald David and Gabrielle, also born in Munich in 1950 and 51, respectively. We know that Jews sometimes had romantic relationships, but these were usually ephemeral. Marriage to a German woman was far less common and less acceptable. We may suppose that, as for other survivors, having children was part of re-entering normal humanity. 2 years later, in 1951, a collective letter in Judeo-Spanish by Greek Jews in Germany, co-signed by Haskiel, arrives in the community, in the Jewish community in Salonika. It is a letter of thanks for sent packages and the community's interest in the predicament of the recipients. It is accompanied by a second letter in Greek, which also contains a list of Thessalonican Jews, the name of the wife of one of them, and the names of two Jews from Corfu. 6 of these people had been residents of Feldafing, and 2 had already left for the United States. One of the 6 is Sam Haskiel, who, according to the letter, worked as a porter before the war. Many Jews worked at the port of Thessaloniki as porter and fishermen. He was living before the war in the district of Rezivardar, which was home for many Jewish proletarians. After the deportation of its inhabitants, the district of Rezivardar was demolished by the municipality, leaving the returning Jews survivor homeless. In September 1952, another letter arrives to the community from Munich, in Greek this time, written on behalf of Samuel Haskiel by a Greek whose, I cite, sense of duty called him to transfer a letter from a Greek Israelite carried by his wife, who came to see him crying. So Sam's wife came to this Greek guy asking him to write a letter in Greek to the Jewish community. The person on whose behalf this correspondence was carried out was Sam Haskiel. From the letter, we learn that Samuel has been imprisoned in Berlin for 6 months, that the trial would take place in a month, and that his family does not have the means to pay for a lawyer. Samuel is already the father of 2 sons, as we said, and the only hope lies in help from the community to pay for the fees of the lawyer. The signatory of the letter emphasizes his patriotic duty to help the Greek Israelite. A week later, the original handwritten letter, along with a typed French translation, was sent by the Jewish community of Salonika to the Jewish community of Berlin. The accompanying note reads, "We do not know anything about the reasons that led our co-religionist to prison, but we believe that he should be assisted so that he can defend his case in court. Legal restrictions, that means concerning sending money abroad, prevent us from doing anything in his favor, and we felt obliged to contact you." Apparently, the community reacts positively towards Haskiel, and as it does for all those who address for assistance: poor people, soldiers in the army, Greek army, prisoners, and also political prisoners, Jews exiled in the islands. Haskiel has been imprisoned around March 1952. Another letter in German, signed by him and probably scribed by his wife, Annie, was mailed to the community of Salonika from prison. The lawyer insists on being paid and threatens him. The community of Berlin has not provided any help. Sam promises to pay back the 200 mark lawyer fees as soon as possible. His family is suffering while he is imprisoned. He hopes that his plea for help from the homeland, Heimat, he writes, will be heard. Sam reappears in the correspondence a year later with a letter in Greek. Still in prison, he dictates the letter to someone who apparently is very fluent in the Greek language. He thanks the community for the certificate he had asked, and he continues, I cite, "Surely you will know my name, and I believe you know that of all our extended family, I'm the only one left, and if today I'm in Germany, this is due to the situation of 42-49. I apologize for writing to you as a Greek Israelite about my situation. I am at the mercy of God, and my only hope for assistance is the Israelite community of Greece. I have lost my brothers, my sister, and my parents in the crematoria of the accursed Hitler. I was lucky to stay alive and to be liberated from the Germans in 1945. The American government supported us at first, but surely today not anymore. Those who were lucky emigrated by various transports. That's the word he uses. Unfortunately, I didn't have that luck. Today, I'm married and I have 2 children, aged 3 and 4. In Germany, where I live, my life is not good because for jobs, first they prefer Germans and we come second as foreigners. This is why I cannot cope with living expenses. I am ashamed to write to you that there are days in our house we do not have the things necessary to stay alive. We lack food. I was obliged to write to you personally. It is of course sad that as a father I cannot provide the livelihood for my children. Therefore, I am asking the community to support me either financially or through a food package. At least 2-3 months should pass until we receive a compensation from Dachau. I look forward to finding myself worthy of fulfilling my duty of assistance to the needy with whom we share a common origin. So he dreams of being able himself to assist his fellow Jews in Thessalonica. Haskiel notes that the only Greek Jews left in Fehrenwald and Munich were a tuberculosis patient in a sanatorium, another one from Athens who was about to leave, and himself. All the rest have emigrated. Therefore, my rescue, salvation, and my hope is in you. The scribe to whom he dictates the letter adopts a style that aims to generate the sense that he really deserves to be assisted by his brothers, not only on the basis of his current hardships, but also of his ambition to become able to help other members of his community in need. It's a kind of dignity here. It is interesting that he mentions 42. That is the year of the gathering of the Liberty in the Liberty Square. The deportations begin in Thessalonica in March 43, much later. And so 42 is the beginning of the forced labor. And the onset of at the onset of the suffering. And the end, 49, that it's not the end of the war, but it's the year that marked the end of the civil war in Greece. Many months later, on the Jewish holidays, the community sends a letter with wishes in which it also asks whether Haskiel has received the 9 boxes of olives they sent to him. At the beginning of December 1955, Sam Haskiel, released from prison, co-signs a letter to the community to Thessaloniki with another guy, with Maurice Baruch. This time, there is a strong tone of protest. I cite, "You are responsible for us because we are brothers in a cursed land. The sufferings we endure, it's one thing to talk about them and another experience them firsthand. We cannot go to Eretz because we are sick and crippled." The letter is written in Judo-Spanish. Vosotros sos responsable por nosotros para los hermanos que estamos en esta tierra maldita. Las sufrencias que estamos sufriendo, otro es al contar y otro es al ver. Si es por la cuestión de partencia en Eretz, no podemos partir, la razón es que estamos jazinos y sacatas. Baruch and Haskiel ask for white cheese, some lakerda, this is salted fish, and a couple of boxes of olives for the holidays. The letter on behalf of the remaining 7 Jews is filled with bitter irony. Who suffers? Better ask who is not suffering here. Here there are Jews from everywhere, and their communities assist them. They do not recognize us as Jews because we don't speak Yiddish. It is our fault if they brought us to the camps. And the consul does not recognize us because the authorities in Greece do not recognize us because in 1949 we did not apply to come down, to repatriate, but still we were born in Greece. And because we did not apply, because some of us were sick in the sanatorium and others in prison, because they threatened us, they threatened Germans, and the Germans took revenge on us. The vocabulary of threat and revenge in the last sentence prompts us to contextualize the offense that landed Haskiel in prison in the climate of suspicion and hostility that sometimes led to clashes in Munich in 1949, demonstration in 1954, and in episodes that interrupted peaceful periods of coexistence. Around the time Haskiel committed the crime which remains unknown, an episode in Föhrenwald was imprinted in the minds of the Jewish press readers. According to an article titled "The Crematoria Are Always There" on May 28, 1952, 115 customs officers and 33 armed Bavarian police stormed the camp from a direct search of trade stores. The report was disputed by Joint Parish Office. Residents threw stones and curses at the tracks. A fight broke out. Injuries ensued. 6 Föhrenwald residents were arrested and brought to trial. As I mentioned previously, all testimonies and reports from this time confirmed these violent events as well as the rising anti-Semitism. Jews were considered both privileged and criminal. Although they did not indulge in black market practices more than everyone else, since at that time it was an illegal but generalized activity that did not always serve as means of profit, but often as a means of survival, they were targeted as preeminent offenders and exploiters. As for the Jews themselves, they did not easily tolerate the idea of being being inferior to Germans. Following the traces of Sam Haskiel in the archives, we discern issues that preoccupy the small collective of Greek Jews that remained in Germany after the closing down of the DP camps. Emigration options that were cancelled due to illness, marriage to a German woman, the birth of children, problems with justice, tense relations with the mother community in Thessaloniki. We may assume that the return to Thessaloniki was not desirable and was perhaps hard to imagine because of the loss of family and all that had been home because of extreme poverty and the prospect of conscription in the bloody civil war. That was the war. He was not allowed to have papers to come back to Greece. He was not enrolled in the army. After all, the refusal to serve the army during the civil war was the reason that, according to the municipal archive, Sam's Greek citizenship was revoked in 1954. When the era of Jewish presence in DP camps in Germany ended, some stateless people felt they had no choice but settle in Germany. Sam Haskiel was one of them. Föhrenwald closed for good in February 1957. In the same year, the camp's synagogue was converted into a training center for Catholic priests. The memory of the stateless Jews that had lived there faded. We do not know the rest of Sam's story from himself. Maybe he has not been asked to tell it, or maybe he did not want to do so. Nor do we learn this story from his 2 children, but through the art of his granddaughter. Yara Haskiel's documentary film, Tsakalos Blues, offers a biographical profile of great historical interest, but it also enables us to enter into the paths of memory and learn something about the intergenerational relations through which they emerge, and by acquainting us with some, the Jew, the Greek, the German, and the proletarian, it invites us to question rigid notions of identity and selfhood. By gathering and connecting fragments that correspond to gaps in her parents' stories, Yara tries to understand what it means to grow up in post-war Germany as a stateless person, and this is something that it is also important for historians to understand. One of the most interesting things in the film is the mirror relationship between the Haskiel family and the family of Sam's pre-war buddy, who was also deported to Auschwitz, but returned to Salonika. The two friends maintained close relationships after the war. The attitudes of sons of the two families interviewed in the film are very different, making us reflect on the forced deportation, the decision to repatriate, or the choice to migration. Come to think of it, the survivors' ordinary trajectories are always extraordinary, unique. Every survival narrative testifies to an exception. Fragments in the archives prompt us to think about individual journeys by Holocaust survivors as active subjects who took their lives into their hands, attempt to build a future new life, and participated in the construction of the post-World War in a landscape of turmoil that was the setting for wanderings and migrations. How can we access this changing world now? The film invites us to reflect on how the ways of making cinema may question our ways of writing history. I believe that such reflection orients us toward a balance between attending to collective and individuals' experiences, between highlighting coincidence and divergence in stories told, between moving from the individual to the social and the other way around. If we want to imagine a comprehensive history of the Holocaust, we must deal with the first post-war decade and the fluid lives of a generation that survived. Correspondence, the written words, and the materiality of the letters are fragments of experiences, traces, that give us a sense of the times from the point of view of the protagonists of the stories, something we tend to underestimate because we know the end of the story. But what did they know? What was the nature of waiting? Waiting for liberation, waiting for healing, waiting for repatriation and reuniting with relatives, family, waiting to rebuild family, waiting for migration, waiting for a letter with news about loved ones, or waiting for a package. In a ruined world, already on its way to reconstruction, the survivors are in a hurry to win back what they lost, to make up for lost time, while they are obliged to show endless patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rika. Amazing documents that you find. I have to say, she's my favorite historian and friend, and I'm really happy and thankful that we are in this constellation today together. And I will also just start my input for today. Forgetting is part of remembering. That is to say, blind spots and gaps are embedded in memory itself, and the act of revising past events retrospectively means that constellations of time and space become actualized in the present. The past is foremost fabricated out of historiographies of the victorious, evoking linear narratives that represent national identity and political conformity. That's why over centuries, indigenous, minority, and colonized people have raised their voices to narrate their unacknowledged and silent collective memories that point to the gaps in dominant colonial, imperial, or national tales within official historiography. The body of work that is shown in the exhibition We Can Never Fly First Class assembles my films, displays for the first time photographs of our family archive and documents from the concentration camps and declined post-war applications for immigration. The photographs show a heterogeneous crowd partying, as you see here on the screen. Talking from a third perspective, third generation perspective, I have informally titled this image Kanakistan, because so-called guest workers, GIs, German proletarians, and many more gathered at my grandparents' bars during the 60s and 70s. They did somehow form a unique network of survival and community. The title, We Can Never Fly First Class, is a quote from my father and alludes not only the class contexts, but also the constellation of different people who gathered at these places where my father had grown up. It seems like another microcosmos to the xenophobic German majority society was vividly lived and celebrated, but not without many frictions and fights. My long-term audiovisual research began already in 2000s. Growing up in Germany as a part of a hybrid and post-migrant third generation, I felt introjected by our official memory culture that had nothing to do with our family history, nor with a glimpse of articulation, visibility, habits, or visual representation. As Stuart Hall frames it, identity is never singular, but it's multiply constructed across intersecting discourses, practices, and positions. For example, stories about so-called mixed marriage, class difference, statelessness, and racism, and criminalization after the Shoa in Germany remains barely addressed in official memory culture. Not even to mention stories about disobedient practices that result out of that and that informs following generation until today. In search for references and similarities, I was astonished by the absence of voices of Greek Jewry in relation to the image of vorbildliche Geschichtsaufarbeitung in Germany supposedly had achieved. How often do narrow approaches and displays of violent histories evoke fixed categories of identity and storylines? After all, missing complexities of remembrance, I argue, cause re-traumatization for affected generations by creating isolating stereotypes that can result in weird projections and assumptions. Healing is definitely not possible within hostile environments that foster neglect and lack of accountability. For me, similar stories were found by traveling to Thessaloniki, first of all, and by encountering the Parento brothers, because of their father, Isaac, was together with my grandfather Sami in the camps, and they had returned to Thessaloniki to Rezivadar, where also my grandfather grew up. Yes, and I will show you a small excerpt of the new work that I was doing for the exhibition, where I show outtakes of the whole footage and material I was developing during this time.
Είχε φίλους, όλους τους είχε φίλους. Και όλοι όταν είχε το μαγαζί, πηγαίναν άνθρωποι και δεν είχαν να φάνε. Έλληνες τους τάιζε τζάμπα, δεν ήταν άνθρωπος που είχε πολύ μεγάλη καρδιά. να είναι προστάτες, κατάλαβες, για να τα παίρνουν. Και μπροστά στο μαγαζί του παππού της ήρθε η αστυνομία, ξέρεις τι έγινε? Μάχη κανονική δηλαδή, όπως βλέπεις στα έργα. Ναι. Ναι. Αυτό πες του. Μάχη. Γιατί όλα τα στέκια του παππού της ήταν σε ελληνικά μαγαζιά. Κατάλαβες? Πιο πολλά, δηλαδή τα τόσα χρόνια που έμεινε στη Γερμανία, μόνο με τη γυναίκα του μιλούσε τα γερμανικά. Έκτοτε στα καφενεία όλα που σύχναζε, γιατί από το πρωί έβγαινε, θα πήγαινε στη Σφάνταλαστράσε. Στη Σφάνταλαστράσε ήταν ένα ελληνικό μαγαζί, πώς λεγότανε, από την Κρήτη, ήταν ένας κριτικός.
Ο κριτικός, έτσι μας το πω.
Ο κριτικός, σου λέω εγώ, εκεί άραζε όχι στο Μανώλη τον κριτικό, αυτό ήταν άλλος, ήταν στη Φάνταλαστράσε. Εκεί άραζε, μετά άνοιξε ένα άλλο. Και πήγαινε και εκεί, πήγαινε και σε ένα άλλο, όχι στη Μαρία Πλάτση, κάπου, δεν θυμάμαι, είχα πάει μια φορά. Με τον μπαμπά και με τον Μόρις, τον φίλο του.
In Germany, you used to be there.
Εσείς στη Ραμόνα έχετε πάει?
Όχι, όχι, δεν πήγα. Εγώ πήγα στο Μόναχο το 1977 πρώτη φορά. Οπότε δεν είχε τίποτα πλέον. Δεν είχε μαγαζί. Ήτανε στην Κύρα. Και τι δουλειές έκανε? Ό,τι μπορούσε έκανε για να συντηρηθεί. Εγώ το γνώρισα τη δεκαετία του 60, όταν ερχόταν εδώ πέρα στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Ερχόταν μαζί με τον Γκάμπη, με τον μπαμπά της. Τότε το γνώρισα και από εκεί έμαθα την ιστορία και τέτοια. Ήταν ένας λεβέτς με το μαλλί, έτσι, με τον Bill Clinton του λαδωμένο. Ήταν ωραίος. Μα ήταν μαζί σε ένα στρατόπεδο τώρα ή στον Πυργενάου, δεν ξέρω γιατί πήγαν σε πολλά. Κάπου
και τις Γιάρας πήγαν ο παππούς.
Ναι, γι' αυτό λέω, κάπου ήταν μαζί. Αυτό το περιστατικό με τις πατάτες που έκλεβε τη νύχτα, ήταν μαζί.
Ήταν μαζί. Ξέρετε, με σιγουριά σου, σε ποιο ήταν μαζί?
Στο Μίλντορφ ήταν. Το Μίλντορφ, άμα το ξέρεις. Μίλντορφ, γιατί με έλεγε αυτό, τα θυμάμαι του πατέρα μου κάτι που με έλεγε. Ο πατέρας μου έκανε τη δουλειά, οι βόμβες που πέφτανε και δεν σκάζανε, πηγαίνανε να τις βγάζανε αυτοί. Ήταν δηλαδή, άμα έσκαζε μία, σκοτώνονταν όλοι. Προκειμένου να. Γιατί άμα δεν δούλευες εκεί πέρα, σε βλέπαν λίγο, σε στέλνανε αδιάβαστο. Όποιος σήκωνε το χέρι και ήταν πρόθυμος, επειδή ο πατέρας μου ήξερε τα ισπανικά, τα γαλλικά, τα γερμανικά, αμέσως τα πιάσε. Και καταλάβαινε τι λέγανε, κατάλαβες. Άμα δεν πήγαινες για δουλειά, άμα δεν ήσουν γερός, ας πούμε, σε στέλνανε. Και αυτό σήκωνε τα χέρια σου, λέει και εδώ πεθαμένος και εκεί πεθαμένος. Και έτσι γλίτωσε. Στο τέλος αυτό που με είχε πει, στην απελευθέρωση όταν μπήκαν οι Αμερικάνοι και βομβαρδίζανε το σταθμό του Μονάχου, τα βαγόνια ήταν γεμάτα τσιγάρα. Δεν ξέρω αν μας το είπε ο κ. Σολομός αυτό το πράγμα.
Πήρε ο Σάμις.
Που πήγαινε, άρπαζε και τα πουλούσε στη Μαρία Πλάτση. Γινόταν έτσι μαύρη αγορά και έπαιρνε λεφτά. Και ο πατέρας μου. Κάνα δουλειά για να.
After the liberation, they found the wagons full of American cigarettes and they were selling them at the capital.
Εν τω μεταξύ, είχε μέσα και σφαίρες μες στα βαγόνια. Όταν το βομβαρδίζαν και σκάζανε, οι σφαίρες πηγαίναν λες και ήταν στο σταθμό. Χαμός γινόταν. Και γλιτώσανε από το χάρο τα δόντια οι άνθρωποι. Δηλαδή είδανε το χάρο, τον είδανε. Δεν φοβόταν πλέον τίποτα, ιδίως. Ο παππούς της ήταν άνθρωπος που δεν γκόλωνε και μάλωνε και έκανε, δηλαδή ήταν άνθρωπος, πώς να σου το πω, μποέμις, δηλαδή μάγκας. Μάγκας με την έννοια, όχι την κακή, να σου κάνει κακό ποτέ. Ήταν φιλότιμος, η έννοια του μάγκα εκεί την εποχή ήταν καλός, δηλαδή φιλότιμος. Δεν πείραζε σαν άνθρωπο. Η μαγιά δεν ήταν τότε όπως είναι σήμερα, ας πούμε, να κάνει, κατάλαβες.
That was one of the first interviews I did in 2011. Oral transmission includes listening, questioning, and often not necessarily getting it. To engage in oral history processes implies alertness and about multifaceted layers of liminal mobilized memories, embodied gestures, pauses, gaps, tears, sighs, grumbles, laughs, exhaustion, silence, and imperceptiveness. The bodily capacity to affect and to be affected. To emphasize on microhistory, situated knowledge and everyday life experience with its specific socio-political condition, leave the sector of fixed categories which evoke hegemonic and linear narratives about historical events in whom even the dead won't be safe from the enemy if he's victorious, to quote Walter Benjamin. Engaging as an artist in memory practices signifies to me to embark on processes of negotiation from within and in relation to others, to seek for analogies, different temporalities, hopefully altering words aesthetically, socially, and ethically. Simultaneously, I keep wondering, especially in Germany, for me being born and raised here, who remembers what and for whom? Which narratives occur at one point in time and where? Who is grievable and who becomes ungrievable? Who commemorates from what situatedness, class, institution, art industries, and so forth? What fictional elements are embedded in representation? And who can speak actually, and who is silenced? This leads to the urgent question of implicatedness. Implication is not identical to complicity. It derives from implicare, meaning to entangle, involve, or connect closely. Complex and contradictory modes of implication thus help to propagate the legacies of historical violence and prop up the structure of inequality that mark the present direct forms of violence and turn out to rely on indirection. Michael Rothberg argues that to think about implication helps to dismantle how both violent histories and socio-political dynamics inform injustice today. Immaterial heritage indifferent to material heritage, which often risks an objectification of distant studies that mere emphasizes on symbolic exploration, consists of fragile textures and liminal layers in their fine, vulnerable meanings and ambivalences. Immaterial heritage remains often unacknowledged because of causing contradictions for those who seek easy answers without shades of gray. Beginning with conversations with my father, Gabriel, I was simultaneously in the search for traces while encountering their absence and erasure. It was a long process of reproductive and productive work between generations, places, different temporalities, and escape routes. Sometimes these conversations open wounds that can cause demobilization and search for repair and containment of shame, anger, anxiety, and sadness. But when within an affect constellation, transmissions and embodied memories change points of references, it is possible to create new movements. They transform to mobilize forces for expression and desire, for altering subjectivities and imagination. In other words, and according to the Italian psychiatrist Franco Basaglia, the task is to transform trauma into strength. Now I will show you an excerpt of Zagalos Blues.
Polizeirazzia auf dem Schwarzen Markt am Deutschen Museum. Aus Angst, bei der nachfolgenden Kontrolle erwischt zu werden, warfen viele die gerade erstandenen Waren fort. Denn jeder, der Schwarzmarktwaren in seinem Besitz hatte, wurde festgenommen. Ebenso jeder, der sie nicht ausweisen konnte, wurde festgenommen.
Und später dann sind wir hier ausgezogen. Da hat er auch mit einem Freund, der hat er mit einem Freund ein Lokal miteinander aufgemacht. Das war dann da vorne ungefähr 1,5 Kilometer in die Richtung Breisauer Straße. Und das Lokal hat dann geheißen bei Sami. Mein Vater hat Sami geheißen und das haben sie dann bei Sami genannt. Und das Lokal ist auch sehr, sehr gut gegangen, muss ich sagen. Da waren dann auch die ganzen Amerikaner, GIs, die waren alle bei uns. Die haben da Party gefeiert und haben da die Sauer, die haben es krauchen lassen. Da war jeden Abend die Hölle los da drin. Es war halt auch die Nachkriegszeit, da waren sie alle entspannt, froh, glücklich. Die Leute waren freier und so. Obwohl sie auch aggressiver waren, die Leute. Da waren auch viele Deutsche, die Amerikaner eigentlich als Besatzungsmacht gar nicht so richtig anerkannt haben. Und da hat es oft Reibereien und Schlägereien gegeben, auch in unserem Lokal. Da ist teilweise ganz schön brutal abgegangen. Und auch der Vater war oft in Schlägereien verwickelt.
Am Anfang hat mir die Schule ja Spaß gemacht. Ich habe gute Noten gehabt bis zur 5. oder 6. Ich glaube, es war sogar in der 6. Klasse, wo ich dann den Stress gehabt habe mit dem Lehrer. Da, ich weiß nicht, Tschech hat der geheißen. Und der habe ich dir erzählt, der hat mich durchs Klassenzimmer gequatscht, weil ich die Hausaufgaben nicht gehabt habe. Und dann bin ich 4 Wochen nicht mehr in die Schule gegangen. Und plötzlich kam Bescheid vom Gericht. Wir müssen vor das Jugendgericht, weil wir einfach die Schulpflichten nicht nachgekommen sind. Und dann hat mein Vater gesagt, ja, ich schicke euch nach Thessaloniki.
Εδώ τώρα βρισκόμαστε στην καρδιά της μπάρας. Εδώ είναι η καρδιά. Εδώ ακριβώς εδώ ήταν τα πιο κακόφημα. Εδώ για να μπορέσεις να μπεις έπρεπε να σε ξέρανε, έπρεπε να είσαι γνωστός. Έναν άγνωστο που βλέπανε δεν καθάριζε από εδώ, δηλαδή θα το κουβαλούσαν 4.
Signor Dania, κολόπλατε.
Πάρτα λίζα και καταπονίζα.
Τα κάνα.
Πάρτα λίζα και καταπονίζα τώρα.
Τα κάνα, λέω.
Ο Σάμις ήταν τσάκαλος. Πώς να σου πω, τώρα να σου πω τη λέξη. Και στη Γερμανία δεν του κουνιότανε κανένας. Αμέσως χρησιμοποιούσε, δηλαδή όταν έφτανε και σε δύσκολες περιπτώσεις.
Δώσε, τριπλό. Δώσε, τριπλό. Μόνο, δεν σε θέλει, 2-3. Φέρνεις ρε, σκιάσους.
Δεν το πήρα και μόλις ερχόταν κανένας Γερμανός και τον έκανε μία έτσι, εδώ είχε το νούμερο. Το νούμερο από τα στρατόπεδα. Το οποίο και ο μπαμπάς μου, βέβαια και όλοι όσοι. Μόλις ερχόταν κανένας και τον έδειχνε αυτό, τρόμαζε ο Γερμανός και έφυγε.
Βγήκαμε. Το κερατά σου, κερατά μασκαρά. Μασκαρά. Τόσο
Αν θέλεις να αναφέρεις ότι εδώ Ό,τι παλιά αυτοκίνητα είχε η Γερμανία τα φέρανε εδώ. Αυτά όλα από Γερμανία. Αυτοί που πηγαίνανε, που έλεγα στο παππούτι στο μαγαζί, είναι αυτοί όλοι που... Αυτά όλα από Γερμανία. Πώς θα λένε από τα Schrottplatz.
Μα δεν είναι. Στα έργα αυτά που έχεις δει δεν είναι τίποτα με λίγο πατέρα. Δηλαδή, στα έργα του Spielberg, αυτό που γύρισε εκείνο το έργο με τους Εβραίους, ας πούμε, δεν είναι τίποτα.
You can see the film in the exhibition. It's 65 minutes long, still 1 week. And I will just shortly go to the second video work, and actually that was the question of Maria before. What is this project about Assembly of Sleepless Matter? And it's still part of my PhD, practice-based PhD that I'm working on. I work on erased cemeteries, and the Jewish cemetery, the former old Jewish cemetery in Thessaloniki is one of them. And in the exhibition you can see the video precarious twilight zones. It's a video essay that combines 6 sites that link the complex layer of the transformation of the Ottoman Empire into the modern history of Greece. The first cycle begins in the aftermath already in 492 with the expulsion of the Muslims and Jews from Spain. In the same year that marks the beginning of colonialism in European and global history. Back then, the Ottomans welcomed them to their territories. Thessaloniki became the so-called Jerusalem of the Balkans. The essay tells the story of an absence. The history of Jewish Thessaloniki remains inscribed in the memories of the living and the legacy of fragmented Jewish tombstones of the vanished biggest Jewish cemetery in Southeast Europe until it was vanished during the German occupation, and today the Aristoteles University is built on. And Rika Benvenistes also already wrote in the early 20 years ago already, was saying that the Jewish history, the Greek Jewish history was only started to be revealed or to be discussed in the 1990s in the realm of memory studies, arguing that first and foremost historiography was to dismantle powerful meta-narratives and has to open itself up to subjects other than national history, as well as its deconstruction, and that has to include awareness on anti-Semitism and nationalism. The making of modernity in Southeast Europe is closely entangled with the interests of the European imperial powers and their desire to influence domestic policies in the Balkan countries with their shifts from being constitutive parts of the Ottoman Empire to independent nation states. The bordering plans between Balkan states were drafted already at the Congress of Berlin, which was also known as a colonial conference, let's say, in 1878. After World War I and 2 Balkan wars, Germany's interest manifested per expansionist and imperialist aspirations via processes of soft power, meaning an economic, moral, and cultural soft conquest embedded in Middle Europe, as outlined by Stephen J. Gross in his book Export Empire. In the cityscape, different temporalities of historic events in northern Greece, drawing subtle analogies to the construction of the nation state, the creation of minorities and the atrocities committed during World War II, the Civil War and dictatorship, and the continuations or analogies through today's students' struggles and migrant struggles in times of so-called post-austerity. The complex violent history in the northern part of the country is intertwined with shifts in minority politics related to religion, ethnicity, and new national subjects of Hellenization, all in the same vein. A central feature of urban planning after the Greek national statehood was achieved and was actually to move the cemeteries to the city's peripheries and to implement a modern French-style colonial urban structure that would eliminate foremost the Oriental elements. Here you see a postcard, the souvenirs, is actually something that only exists in northern Greece because it was, these postcards are from the Allied armies, from the Orient Army, parts of them French and English, and they made photos and they gave them wrong titles, as you see. Because they were mistaken, the Muslim and the Jewish cemeteries, because they could not access their own Orientalism, I want to say. So my artistic method of remapping sites and the cityscapes derives from my pathways in research, conversation, and my own subjective reference to Thessaloniki. It does not follow the idea of tracing tool or map for opening up a territory, but relies instead on us becoming aware of the voids in its expression by walking through the places in question. The body of the student itself, which you will see now, becomes a medium that guides us through the chosen sites to omit spoken language in this piece. Is actually an attempt to try to work out a plane of affect. It's not in Zagalos Blues. I was working with oral history and transference and lost languages and trying to gain new languages. In this film, I worked exactly not without any language because I was trying to work with affect, body, contested place, and physical matter in the urban space. In this sense, it was a try or attempt to do a mapping as an embodied practice, in a sense. And this is a view of the cemetery. And this is a view, I guess, from a German soldier onto the tombstones that they were used as all kinds of, well, construction material, I would rather not say, because you find the fragments in the whole cityscape, basically. And this was a photo from the 50s. It was a 500 square meter big. 500,000.
Ταυτότητα, δημοσιογράφος είμαι και σύμβαση έχω.
Πώς σε λένε.
Λιτσαρδάκης.
Ωραία, τώρα.
Στο πανεπιστήμιο μου! Στο πανεπιστήμιο! Στο πανεπιστήμιο! Ρίξε ένα χημικό! Δεν βλέπω!
Δεν θα αγγίξει κανένας.
Θα φύγεις τώρα να τελειώνουμε. Γιατί να φύγω τώρα να τελειώνουμε, τη δουλειά μου κάνω, δεν κατάλαβα.
Τι έκανε!
Μην ακουμπάς.
Τι ακούμπησα ρε! Τι ακούμπησα!
Έλειωσε το θέμα. Πρέπει να
ακούμπησα! Συγγνώμη, από πότε το πανεπιστήμιό μου! Από το πανεπιστήμιό μας!
Πήγαινε μαζί με τους υπόλοιπους.
Ό,τι γουστάρω θα κάνω! Ό,τι γουστάρω θα κάνω! Τι θα με κάνεις! Δίνε με! Δίνε με! Έχουμε βγάλει το βάλτο, δίνε με! Τι έχω!
Έλα.
Πού είμαι!
I leave it here. I'm sure there are many questions now. Thank you.
Now? Okay. Yeah, your second film, Yara, Twilight. No, it's called Twilight. Twilight Zones. Precarious, and it's very complex, and there are many references, and I didn't get every reference, so I understood now what you meant with Sleepless Assembly. But it's worth looking this film because it has many references to these entangled histories about which we heard today. And I would start with a comment maybe on the beginning. We begin with Munich. That's the beginning of the story, or of your story, or the story of your father and of your grandfather as heimatloser Ausländer. And in my work as an historian on migration history, on German migration history, the heimatlose Ausländer were a group which I discovered very later on, because in the German imagination, immigration history begins in 1955 with the first Italian guest workers to come. But in reality, the first foreigners in Germany were the heimatlose Ausländer, and they are connecting directly the history of the National Socialism with the post-Nazi era, and are a direct link, not just the German folk, as some German historian said, there was a continuity, Volkskontinuität, he told it, and I framed the phrases, there was also a Ausländerkontinuität, because, and we see in this group of heimatlose Ausländer, those DPs who, from various reasons, as you showed, you said it was mainly out of health reasons, or that they had too many children, that they don't had the opportunity to emigrate to another country, and it was Jewish DPs. It also were Polish DPs that had worked as also as not slave workers, but as forced workers, and those people formed this group of stateless foreigners, a very heterogeneous group, and one larger group in this group were Greek Jews, whose history is not only forgotten or not known here, but in Greece it was a long time, or I'm sure there are parts of the society who still don't know anything about Greek Jew history, or Jewish history, or Greek Jewish history. Maybe you can say what is the correct term in these entangled histories in the end. But one thing I want to say is that you said in my comment now you said, Rika, there was a rising anti-Semitism in Germany, in post-war Germany. I would say it was never gone. It was a continuity of anti-Semitism, and I can tell it because I've looked the other side of the story, the German micro-histories from that time. You too looked into the micro-histories of the Jewish people who lived this experience, and I think that this time is characterized by one phrase that one American historian said this phrase, that it was a toxic stew of racisms at that time here in Germany, at the end of the 40s, the 50s, and it stayed in kind of continuity like this with all the other groups that came and all these layers that we found there. But now to come to your work, in a way you both are searching for traces in spaces that are, you think you can call them empty places. They are not empty, but they are places that are, the histories of these places are ignored or not known, as the cemetery, for example. We saw the pictures here. And you do this via this micro-historical lens. My question to you would be, is that how you describe your work? And would you say that your different approaches, art and history as a science, or you also work with history, also open up other perspectives, complement each other? Or would you say it is quite symbiotic, these two approaches? And I don't know, you can take this, maybe Rika, you may start.
Thank you, Maria. There is something that I really admire in Yara's film. She manages to convey the complexity, the depth of characters. This is something very, very difficult for a historian to do. We can't. So this is art. This is literature, this is cinema, but this is not history. On the other hand, I would agree with you that we both working after traces. And there is a famous, I noted this, what I would like to remind what Carlo Ginzburg, is considered one father of microhistory, says about traces. The hunter would have been the first to tell a story because he alone was able to read to the silent, nearly imperceptible tracks left by his prey, a coherent sequence of events. So we are trying to build a story, to tell a story, following traces. And, well, as a historian, I have to follow written records, written traces, and Yara invents a language that I think she can make us think, makes about what we are not able to see as historians. And on the other hand, there is something also more in common, probably. I don't know if you agree, that we both deal with forgotten histories, but also with different means, following a list of names, for example, or going back to your family and interviewing your father, asking about your grandfather. And so forgotten histories, traces, and probably a third thing that you also mentioned Maria, places. And entangled histories means different places. And contextualization, you always contextualize what I think, Yara, in your work is very important, is this intergenerational framework. In my case, contextualization also goes all the time from the individual to the collective. So, but okay, the individual probably is simple, but what is the collective? The collective is, in our case, is the proletarian class, is Jews, is the community, is the city, and then the different camps, because they move from one camp to another, and then they land to Germany. Most of them, it's a provisional, it's a waiting room, waiting to emigrate, and very few among them, they stay here. So it's make us think always changing scale and changing context. There is one last thing about microhistory. Microhistory does not mean just small scale. It's not one family, one person, one case that makes something being, that makes microhistory. Microhistory is moving between the small and the big image, the personal and the collective. Well, I spoke to.
Maybe one thing that you can take on this, there is the notion of the counter story. Would you think that these stories, these micro histories that you find are kind of counter stories also to the narratives that we have? Maybe in your answer for my first set of questions, you can take this on this. It's from critical race theory. This is why I ask you this notion of counter stories.
Not counter histories, counter stories, counter storytelling.
Counter storytelling. Yeah. And counter stories are the stories they tell then.
Yeah. No, I think I don't work with the kind of enemy, that I'm looking at.
Okay.
I'm not looking at the dispositive, what's there in order to create my counter story, but I think immaterial heritage and situated knowledge means also you working actually from within. And what I find, and why I said also in terms of microhistories, I think what is interesting, I think it's that Rika also, she follows the biographies and letters and exchanges of correspondence, and this kind of documents itself become a narrative or a story because they also somehow transpose the connections between the people. So actually the network that I was thinking about it now, no? It's a retracing of the social connections, because you said the individual and the collective and the social. And I think this has also to do of an approach of how to research. It's a kind of positionality, if you want so, to start with the stories that you encounter, and you follow up another story that derives from the first one, and so on. So they become somehow chains that derive from the stories itself. I think maybe the counter element would be that, how do you say, this kind of this work of sich abarbeiten an etwa. I mean, that you, of course, there are many questions if you go and read history books that they tell only the macro story, but because you don't, as Marco Parente said in the video, which is also, I mean, the Steven Spielberg movies that he mentions, the fiction movies, for him they say nothing about what happened, you know, in the Shoah. So also the attempts to only show a kind of one-sided narrative or a kind of, fictionalized dramas that I find also today in official memory culture. So, but I would not say that I'm trying to create counter-image to this because it's too stressful, you know. I think it's more vivid and more lively to try to find your own way, you know, your own method. Somehow, what means memory practices in a sense for an artist and also for an historian. I think it's also a practice of practicing memory, no? I mean, yeah.
And I think there are two more things that I would like. Yes, it's on. It's on? Yeah. Two more little things that I would like to mention. First thing is that, well, these people were victims. They were tortured. But on the other hand, they took their lives in their hands, and they were active subjects. And Yara sees these people as active persons. This is very, very important. And also something that was erased, that faded, was the first post-war years. I mean, recently, relatively recently, in historiography, we deal with the 50s, not from a point of view of politics and Cold War and everything, of course. This is very, very, very important, and there are very important good works on this, but what happened in daily lives. And we discovered that the Shoah continues, its effects go on during these years. And these were the years that, I mean, my generation was born. And we belong to this world. And it is very important to see what happened and what happened to our families.
Yeah, and I think this is very impressive in both of your works that you that you show this entanglement also in a spatial way, which connects all of Europe. It's a transnational European history you tell, both of you, and also combines time or shows the continuity of it's not a story that is ended at that point, but has a long after story. And speaking about these two combinations, the Greek history of the Shoah, its far-reaching consequences for Thessaloniki and the situation of Greek Jews in Greece and in Germany in the post-National Socialist era, as we heard today, are not sufficiently known or remembered in Germany and in Greece. And what do you think? What do you think? Was it a failure in dealing with this part of history, which resulted in an incomplete or even faulty remembrance? Is this ignored history? How do you explain why these histories and these perspectives form a history of ignorance? You can tell it a history of ignorance, and what did this do to the survivors and their descendants, to their identities? I know very big questions, but we have a little time, and so I ask all at once.
I think it's not a Greek particularity.
Yeah.
I think it's not a Greek particularity, the fact that although entire Jewish community were erased, this distraction was silenced. For different reasons, in different countries, there was a kind of, someone has said that every country has its own Vichy syndrome. That means that they forgot for different reasons. In Greece, there was, of course, the Civil War. The Civil War was very, very important because collaborators were incorporated in the regime, and their crimes remained unpunished because Greek Jewry was no more a political factor. And Jews themselves had to deal with the pressing demands to build a new life, to rebuild a life. So, and of course, their neighbors who had also suffered the war, during the war, they were not willing listeners to their stories. So it took many decades, not only in Greece, but everywhere to have this explosion of memory in the 80s, when usually we say that it was the Eichmann's trial that brought the survivors and their testimonies to the scene. And so in the 80s we have a multiplication of testimonies and written or these big projects of oral history. And these testimonies also influence the way we write history, because we started asking ourselves, what should we do with the stories told by survivors? Should we incorporate them in our histories? Should we leave them apart? It was a big theoretical discussion, very interesting. Well, going back to Walter Benjamin, if we want to, that Yara talked about, if we want to have a position from the victim's side, not not the victorious, we should listen to them. We should find a way to incorporate in our story their stories and how they tell them. And this was true in Greece, everywhere, in other places in the 80s, in Greece a little bit later, but it's the same movement.
Thank you. Yara, maybe you could say something to the last part of my question, what this history of ignorance does with own memories of survivors and their descendants, because this was the journey you started at one point to go backwards. Yeah.
Yes, it's like a kind of irritation if you don't have, if you don't find reference, or, you know, in a mainstream German society, as I said, it was like, okay, what is your history? What is my history actually? Or what is the history of, you know, what actually happened? You know, you grow up somewhere and you don't find somebody on the next corner to say, yeah, this happened. Yes, I know, I have the same, you know, I have the same problem. No, doesn't exist. didn't exist. I had met a new friend from my generation, my same age, when I was in Thessaloniki, and I was astonished. I was like, I did an interview with Yosif Anna, and he was telling about his grandfather and how he grew up in Rezivadar, and what kind of stories he was told when he was small, because they lived together in the same house. And I was like, this is the first person I meet that I could relate to in a certain sense. But here I didn't find anyone except of my family, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and but it was an impressive result that your search brought on, and that you also went beyond these histories, and the topic that you have in your last film is also these intertwined German and Greek histories. And there is an entangled history between Greece and Germany that is also not known, and some have called it a kind of that for Germany, Greece was a kind of a crypto colony, and I think this is what you are working on currently, and. We all lived this in the time of the financial crisis in Greece, because there was a time where Greek restitution claims were made again, and some German politicians had a quite critical, I say, critical stance on that, but also on Greeks and how they handled their finances. But on the other hand, some Greek protesters, or many Greek protesters, or even politicians, framed West German politicians as Angela Merkel as a Nazi and portrayed them with such symbols. And there were others who said this might be a kind of trivialization or relativation of the Shoah, and also the Greek part of the Shoah, because there were also Greek collaborators at that time. So it's was it an understandable, in your view, understandable reactions of outrage to German insensitivity and self-righteousness, or is it too complex, this field, to say it's this, or is there anything, is there a moral right or wrong in this context? Another big question.
No, I agree with you, Maria, that labeling a politician or a government or a country as Nazi is a kind of trivialization, relativization. It is something that might obscure our historical understanding of the Shoah in this case. I don't mean, of course, that there are not neo-Nazis in governments or people who negate the Holocaust. This is another thing. I would like, however, to emphasize that we should be aware of labeling our practices which erase our critical position. Let me make it more clear. There are some real problems. There is a real problem of the issue of justice and restitution that has nothing to do with Nazism. And of course, there is a real problem, historical problem, of Greek collaborators, but it is a fact that has nothing, and that cannot diminish the fact and the responsibility of the Nazi machinery for deportation and assassination of the Jews. So I say that we should see the things separately. Labeling, it's dangerous, but we should keep in mind a critical stance toward what is the real problem, what is the real danger. Probably there are two different dangers.
Yeah. Would you like to?
I think, well, my impression is on the question on reparations. Not only my impression, I think it was a kind of workaround in actually not paying the reparations with the 2+4 agreement, and in Paris in February 46, there was a victorious power conference, and there was a calculated Greek claim for reparations over $7 billion. In the 60s, with one exception, they were paid 1,115 million Deutsche Marks to only those who were persecuted for political, religious, or racist reasons during World War II. But in fact, not everybody had, of course, with this, with these categories received reparation payments. Nor the government in Greece gave it to everybody, because we are in a time where the communists were somehow persecuted. So Jewish communists, for example, had, I guess, no chance to get any reparations. And there are similar details that has been worked out about let's say, a reclaimment of houses, property, and so on. It's another story, but I know that historians are working on it, and there are some new insights. So the German argument remains the same with the 2+4 agreement in the 90s and the reunification. Greece supposedly gave up its rights. It is until today, it's a kind of legacy from the London Agreement on German external debts from '53, where the Federal Republic of Germany saw its war debts reduced to 50%. I mean, the war debts were firstly reduced and stretched out over 30 years. And it was actually in the agreement said that with the reunification of Germany, there should be a peace contract, and then somehow the process would start. But in also naming the project, the contract differently, and made a reformulation of the whole agreement under Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who played a crucial role. They were they were renegating their war debts, and it was also basically to avoid also individual claims by survivors from Greek looted villages, from the war against partisans. And it was also to renegade the claims from other partisans and other survivors from Italy, Yugoslavia, Belarus, Belgium, and Ukraine. And I find it astonishing that we have all this debate now. And not only debate, we have a war going on. And I find it astonishing that Zelensky comes and says, I'm reminded, he comes to the European Human Rights Court, he was, right? Or he was in some, I don't know, official speech where he was kind of comparing the Nuremberg trials to a kind of human rights, leave this out, but I how can you, why this is not approached, right? I mean, why this is neglected still? For me, this is really also a kind of very weird thing that's going on. meanwhile. Yes.
So I think all that you referred to now, this is the legacy of the Cold War we are dealing now, because in the context of the Cold War, many of the things that weren't, or the role that Germany played, or West Germany had, or as you said, the political elite that played in Greece the role or the communists and so on. And so we deal now with all these legacies of the Cold War, and this, I think, is what we historians will have to work on the next decades, I think. Thank you so much for your insights and your work, and I hope we will read and see much more of you. Thank you for your patience for 2 hours, I think we were here. Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you, Simon, for making this possible tonight.
Thanks.